From a small group of followers in first-century Judea to over 2 billion adherents around the globe today, Christianity's story spans 2 millennia. It began with Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish teacher who was crucified around 30 AD in the Roman province of Judea. His followers believed he rose from the dead, and they set out to spread his teachings. Over time, this new faith grew from a persecuted sect into the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and eventually into the world's largest religion. Our journey begins in the ancient land of Judea, a province of the Roman Empire. Here, around 4 BC, according to tradition, Jesus was born into a Jewish family. By about 30 AD, he had gathered a small group of disciples and began teaching and healing in the regions of Galilee and Judea. Jesus preached about the kingdom of God, challenged social norms, and attracted attention with reported miracles. His message and growing following alarmed some authorities, leading to his execution by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate around 30 AD, an event widely attested by historical sources. After Jesus' crucifixion, his disciples proclaimed that he had risen from the dead, which became the cornerstone of their faith. They began spreading his teachings in Jerusalem and beyond, marking the birth of Christianity. In these early years, the followers of Jesus were primarily Jewish, and saw themselves as part of the Jewish community, differing only in their belief that Jesus was the Messiah, the Anointed One, long expected in Jewish tradition. The book of Acts describes how, at Pentecost, they experienced a dramatic event that empowered them to preach, leading to the baptism of many new believers. Early Christians met in homes for prayer, fellowship, and a shared meal commemorating Jesus' Last Supper, an early form of the Eucharist. Visualizing this period, documentaries often depict small gatherings in humble houses, sharing bread and wine by lamplight, scenes that convey the simplicity and secrecy of the first Christian communities. One of the most important early Christian figures was Paul of Tarsus. Originally named Saul, Paul was a Jewish Pharisee who had persecuted the Christians until he experienced a sudden conversion after a visionary encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus. Paul became a tireless missionary, traveling across the eastern Mediterranean, Asia Minor, Greece, and even to Rome, to establish churches. He wrote letters, epistles, to these fledgling congregations, writings that would later form a significant portion of the New Testament. Thanks to Paul and other missionaries, by the end of the 1st century, Christian communities had sprung up in many cities of the Roman Empire, including Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome. During this time, accounts of Jesus' life and teachings were recorded in the Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, which were composed between roughly 65 AD and 100 AD. These writings circulated among the communities, providing a shared narrative and doctrine. Visually, a documentary might show a map of the Roman Empire with glowing dots popping up in places like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Rome to represent the spread of the early churches. Reenactments frequently portray Paul trudging along Roman roads or sailing across the Mediterranean to spread the good news. We also often see scenes of conflict, Roman soldiers chasing Christians, or the stoning of Stephen, considered the first Christian martyr, common visual motifs that illustrate the dangers faced by the early believers. In its first centuries, Christianity remained a minority faith, sometimes tolerated, often viewed with suspicion by both Jewish authorities and Roman officials. Many Romans misunderstood Christian practices and beliefs, for instance, mistaking the Eucharist for cannibalism or viewing refusal to worship Roman gods as a sign of disloyalty to the empire. Periodically, this led to persecution. The Roman Emperor Nero famously blamed the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, leading to brutal executions of Christians in the city. Over the next 2 centuries, other emperors launched empire-wide persecutions. Decius around 250 AD and Diocletian around 303 AD, among others. Christians who refused to renounce their faith were imprisoned, tortured, or executed in gruesome public spectacles. The era earned the Church many martyrs, a term for those who died for their faith, and their courage under trial inspired others. Despite hardships, the faith continued to grow in numbers and organization. By the early 3rd century, the Christian movement, once just a few dozen followers, had grown to perhaps over 1 million adherents within the Roman Empire. This growth was facilitated by the empire's roads and trade routes, a common Greek language, koine, across the East, and the inclusive message of Christianity, which attracted people from diverse backgrounds. Women, slaves, and the poor found in Christianity a spiritual equality and community support often lacking in wider society. The religion began to develop a more formal structure. Each city with Christians had elders or overseers, later called bishops, who led the community's worship and charity, and regional councils of bishops met occasionally to ensure consistency in teaching. Even under threat, Christians organized charitable efforts, caring for the sick and the poor, which won admiration from some pagan neighbors. Documentaries about this era often highlight secret worship in the catacombs of Rome, miles of underground tunnels where Christians are said to have gathered and buried their dead. Though the extent of catacomb worship is debated, the imagery of believers singing hymns by torchlight in hidden chambers is a powerful visual theme. Another common scene is the amphitheater. Films depict martyrs like a young woman or an elderly bishop, steadfast in faith as they face wild beasts or gladiators before crowds in places such as the Colosseum. These dramatic reconstructions, while stylized, capture the resolve and sacrifice of early Christians and set the stage for a major turning point to come. A watershed moment in Christian history occurred in the early 4th century. In the year 312 AD, as legend holds, the Roman general Constantine the Great, marched to battle his rival for the throne. On the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky and the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol, perhaps the Chi-Rho monogram, on their shields. Constantine won the battle, and soon after, as emperor, he embraced Christianity. In 313 AD, he and co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting freedom of religion throughout the empire and officially ending the persecution of Christians. This pivotal decree legalized Christianity and allowed the once persecuted faith to operate openly and worship freely. The age of the martyrs was effectively over, and the transition to a Christianized Roman Empire had begun. The newfound imperial support transformed Christian fortunes dramatically. Constantine restored confiscated church property and sponsored the construction of grand churches, including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Christianity went from underground gatherings to impressively public worship in basilicas filled with mosaics and incense. To resolve debates over doctrine, Constantine also took the unprecedented step of summoning bishops from all over the empire to a council. The First Council of Nicaea met in 325 AD in Asia Minor, where approximately 300 bishops debated the nature of Christ's divinity. The council produced the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith declaring Jesus as true God from true God, affirming that the Son of God was of the same essence as God the Father, countering the teachings of Arius, who argued Jesus was a created being. Nicaea was a landmark in defining Orthodox Christian theology. It also set a precedent for future ecumenical councils to decide important issues of belief and practice. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had moved from tolerated faith to the official religion of the Roman Empire. In 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius I issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Nicene Christianity the state church of the empire. Other sects were branded heretical. Pagan temples were progressively closed. Theodosius ordered the closure of pagan sanctuaries in 391 AD, and Christianity became entwined with imperial structures. This rapid shift is often illustrated in documentaries by contrasting visuals. One moment shows humble worshippers hiding from Roman soldiers, and the next shows a Christian bishop in purple robes strolling through the halls of Constantine's palace. Such imagery underscores one of history's great ironies. The empire that once crucified Jesus and hunted his followers eventually came to embrace his religion at the highest level of power. However, along with imperial favor came new challenges. Theological disputes that had simmered among scholars now took center stage, sometimes causing bitter divisions. Different interpretations of Christ's nature led to schisms. For example, after the Council of Nicaea, debates continued over how to understand Jesus' humanity and divinity. In 431 AD, the Council of Ephesus condemned Nestorianism, the idea that Jesus had two separate persons, one human and one divine, causing churches in Persia and the East to break away. These became known as the Church of the East, often called Nestorian. 2 decades later, the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD affirmed that Christ has two natures in one person, fully God and fully human. Those who rejected Chalcedon, including many in Egypt, Syria, and Armenia, formed the Oriental Orthodox Communion, separating from the imperial church. Thus, even before the fall of Rome, Christianity was not monolithic. It had branched into different traditions over doctrinal nuances. At the same time, the faith was spreading beyond the empire's borders. In the early 4th century, Armenia became the first kingdom to adopt Christianity as its official state religion, traditionally dated to 301 AD under King Tiridates III. Missionaries like Saint Gregory the Illuminator played a key role in Armenia's conversion. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, Christianity had also reached the Kingdom of Ethiopia, Aksum, as well as communities in India, the St. Thomas Christians tracing back to ancient times. The vision of Christianity as a faith only for the Roman world was fading as it became a religion with outposts in Africa and Asia. To convey this era's atmosphere, visual storytelling might include council scenes, bishops in debate, scrolls of scripture unfurled, and theological arguments occurring under candlelight in imperial halls. We might also see the figure of Constantine in royal attire, convening the bishops at Nicaea, or gazing upward at a symbol of the cross before battle. The twilight of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century brought turmoil, but Christianity endured and even expanded its influence. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell to barbarian chieftains, marking the end of Roman imperial rule in the West. Yet the Christian Church provided a measure of continuity amidst the political collapse. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and other church leaders became important figures in maintaining learning and social order. Monasteries and clergy in Western Europe preserved not only Christian writings, but also many classical texts, acting as repositories of knowledge during the chaotic early Middle Ages. Monks devoted to prayer and scholarship copied manuscripts by hand in scriptoria, writing rooms, keeping literacy alive. In popular documentaries, scenes of monks laboring over illuminated manuscripts by candlelight or ringing bells in isolated monasteries encapsulate how the Church became a beacon of light in Europe's dark ages. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, persisted for another 1,000 years with its capital in Constantinople. Christianity thrived in the Byzantine world, developing its own rich traditions. The great church Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, with its magnificent dome completed in 537 AD, stood as the largest church in Christendom and a visual symbol of the era's faith. The Byzantine Christian tradition, conducted in Greek, evolved somewhat separately from the Latin Christianity of the West. Throughout the early Middle Ages, circa 5th to 10th centuries, Christian missionaries carried the faith to new peoples of Europe. In the late 5th century, the Frankish king Clovis I converted to Christianity, according to tradition, in 496 AD, and his Frankish kingdom, in Gaul, roughly modern France, became Christian. Over the next few centuries, Irish and British missionaries like St. Patrick in Ireland and St. Columba to Scotland evangelized the Celtic and Pictish peoples. By the 7th century, St. Augustine of Canterbury had led a mission that converted the Anglo-Saxons in England. In Central Europe, monks such as St. Boniface preached to the Germanic tribes. The faith also reached beyond Europe's old Roman frontiers. By 988 AD, Vladimir the Great, Prince of Kievan Rus, in today's Ukraine, Russia, embraced Eastern Orthodox Christianity, leading to the Christianization of the Eastern Slavs. Each of these missionary endeavors is a story of adventure and cultural interchange. Images of monks trudging through deep forests or kings being baptized in rivers are often used in videos to illustrate the spread of Christianity among barbarian nations. However, the medieval church also faced new external challenges. In the 7th century, a new religious force, Islam, arose in Arabia under the Prophet Muhammad. The early Muslim conquests were swift and dramatic. By the mid-700s, Muslim armies had taken Syria, the Holy Land, Egypt, and North Africa, all regions that had been heartlands of ancient Christianity. The city of Jerusalem and its sacred Christian sites fell under Muslim rule, 638 AD, as did Alexandria and Carthage. This Islamic expansion significantly reduced Christian territories in the Middle East and North Africa, and many inhabitants of those lands gradually converted to Islam. Still, ancient Christian communities survived under Muslim governance. For example, the Coptic Church in Egypt and the Syriac churches in the Middle East endured, albeit as minorities. Meanwhile, Islam's advance into Europe was halted in the West by Frankish forces at the Battle of Tours, 732 AD, and contained in the East by the Byzantine Empire, which defended Constantinople from Arab sieges. Documentaries often use maps with sweeping arrows to show the rapid spread of Islam and its impact on the Christian world, underscoring how, by 750 AD, the Mediterranean was divided between Christian and Muslim realms. Despite these trials, medieval Christianity continued to mature in its institutions. The papacy, office of the Pope, grew in authority in the West. A major development came in 800 AD when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, as Emperor of the Romans. This act revived the idea of a Western Roman Empire, later called the Holy Roman Empire, and forged a link between the papacy and European monarchs. It also hinted at an emerging rivalry. Should ultimate authority rest with the Pope or with emperors? Such power struggles would recur throughout the Middle Ages. By the High Middle Ages, Christianity had clearly diverged into two major cultural spheres: the Latin-speaking West, centered on Rome, and the Greek-speaking East, centered on Constantinople. Various differences, linguistic, political, theological, and liturgical, had been growing for centuries. Tensions climaxed in 1054 AD, when mutual excommunications were exchanged between the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople in a dispute over authority and doctrine. This event is known as the Great East-West Schism, and it formally split Christianity into two distinct branches, the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. After 1054, each branch developed separately, with its own traditions and leadership. Catholics recognized the Pope as supreme head, whereas Orthodox Christians followed the leadership of their own patriarchs and bishops in communion with Constantinople. Documentaries often illustrate the schism with imagery of two bishops, or even two processions of clergy, turning their backs on each other, or a map showing Europe's religious divide, a line separating Latin Catholic regions from Greek Orthodox lands. Surprisingly, not long after this bitter split, the Eastern Byzantine Empire appealed to their estranged Western brothers for help. In the late 11th century, Byzantine lands were threatened by the advance of the Muslim Seljuk Turks, who had won a crucial battle at Manzikert in 1071 and overrun much of Anatolia, modern Turkey. In response, Pope Urban II in 1095 called for Christian knights to go on an armed pilgrimage to aid the East and liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. The result was the Crusades, a series of military expeditions lasting from 1096 through the 13th century that aimed to reclaim Jerusalem and defend Eastern Christians. The First Crusade succeeded dramatically. By 1099, Crusader armies captured Jerusalem amid much bloodshed, establishing Christian-ruled states in the Levant. Over the next 2 centuries, Crusader kingdoms would rise and fall, and several major crusade campaigns were launched, including some infamous failures like the Children's Crusade and the ill-fated Fourth Crusade. The Crusades loom large in popular history, and thus feature prominently in visual media about Christianity. Scenes of armored knights bearing the sign of the cross on their tunics, marching across deserts, or laying siege to walled cities are staples of crusade narratives. These images highlight both the religious zeal and the violence of this chapter in Christian history. In a documentary style, one might see the enthusiastic preaching of Pope Urban II to the crowds, perhaps at Clermont, France in 1095, followed by sequences of thousands of European warriors taking up the cross and journeying to the Holy Land. Another frequent visual, the moment when Crusaders finally see Jerusalem from afar and fall to their knees in prayer, tears in their eyes, a dramatic portrayal of faith and warfare intertwined. The Crusades ultimately had mixed outcomes. While they did open short-lived Christian enclaves in the Middle East and slowed the Turkic advance for a time, They also deepened the rift between Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholics. In 1204, Western Crusaders on the Fourth Crusade diverted to Constantinople and brutally sacked the Christian Byzantine capital, an act that Orthodox Christians have never forgotten. The image of Crusader knights looting churches in Constantinople is a shocking visual, sometimes depicted to show how even a holy war could devolve into greed and fratricide. By 1291, the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, Acre, fell, ending the Frankish presence there. The Middle East remained under Muslim dominion, and the Byzantine Empire, though it recovered Constantinople, was left weakened. It would eventually fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. During the same high medieval era, the Catholic Church in the West was undergoing internal change and reform. The Gregorian Reform, named after Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century, sought to curb corruption, end the practice of simony, buying church offices, and enforce clerical celibacy. Popes like Gregory VII even dared to challenge mighty emperors over investiture, who had the right to appoint bishops, illustrating the Church's claims of supremacy over secular rulers. Monastic orders flourished, including the Benedictines, Cluniacs, Cistercians, and later mendicant orders like the Franciscans, founded by St. Francis. Francis of Assisi in the early 1200s and Dominicans. These monks and friars not only pursued holiness, but also became scholars, missionaries, and educators. The University of Paris and University of Oxford were founded in this period, 12th to 13th centuries, often under church sponsorship, marking the rise of scholasticism, a method of learning that applied reason to understand faith. Men like Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, wrote monumental works, e.g. Summa Theologica, trying to systematize Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy. The medieval church also confronted dissenting movements. Some Christians began to question the wealth and worldliness of the official church. In response, church authorities cracked down on what they deemed heresy. In the 13th century, the Inquisition was established, church courts that investigated and punished heresy. Groups like the Cathars in southern France were brutally suppressed. Visually, this part of history might be shown through dark, solemn scenes, a shadowy medieval courtroom with robed inquisitors, or bonfires consuming heretical books, imagery that conveys the severity of religious control in the Middle Ages. By the 14th century, internal strains were evident. The papacy itself fell into disarray during the Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, when rival popes in Rome and Avignon each claimed authority. This chaos undermined the Church's credibility and set the stage for calls for reform. As the medieval era gave way to the Renaissance, Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries experienced a cultural rebirth and a growing spirit of inquiry. The printing press was invented around 1440, enabling ideas and scriptures to spread more rapidly. Scholars studied not only scripture but also the writings of the early church in their original languages, and some grew critical of what the church had become. Many felt that the Catholic Church, centered in Rome, had accumulated too much wealth and power and strayed from its spiritual roots. This discontent led to one of Christianity's most significant turning points, the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The Reformation began dramatically in 1517, when a German monk and theology professor, Martin Luther, famously nailed his 95 theses to the church door in Wittenberg, according to tradition. These theses challenged the church's sale of indulgences, documents granting remission of penalties for sin, and called for debate on other practices. Luther's writings, aided by the printing press, spread quickly across Europe. What started as an attempt to reform the Catholic Church snowballed into a religious revolution. Luther was excommunicated, and many German princes defied the emperor by siding with Luther, leading to the establishment of new Christian communities independent of the Pope's authority. These protesters against Rome came to be called Protestants. Luther translated the Bible into German, putting scripture in the hands of ordinary people. Soon, other reformers emerged: Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, John Calvin in Geneva, and many others, each promoting reforms in doctrine and church governance. Calvin, for example, emphasized God's sovereignty and taught the doctrine of predestination, shaping what came to be known as the Reformed tradition. In England, King Henry VIII broke from Rome, for both personal and political reasons, and established the Church of England in 1534, leading to Anglicanism. More radical reformers, such as the Anabaptists, insisted on adult baptism and a complete separation of church and state. Some of these groups faced persecution from both Catholics and other Protestants. The Christian landscape of Europe was irrevocably changed. Instead of one unified Catholic Christendom, there were now multiple denominations with differing doctrines and forms of worship. Documentary visuals for the Reformation often include the dramatic Luther scene, hammer in hand at Wittenberg's door, and images of printing presses churning out pamphlets. We might see close-ups of newly printed Bibles, or ordinary people reading the Bible in their own language with wonder. Another frequent visual, fiery debates or sermons, such as Luther refusing to recant before the imperial diet at Worms in 1521, declaring, "Here I stand." These cinematic moments help capture the courageous and confrontational spirit of the Reformers. The Catholic Church responded with its own counter-reformation. It convened the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, to address abuses and clarify Catholic doctrines in the face of Protestant teachings. Trent reaffirmed traditional beliefs, such as the authority of the Pope, the importance of church tradition, and the seven sacraments, and enacted some internal reforms, like better clergy education and ending the worst corruption. New religious orders sprang up to reinvigorate the Church, notably the Society of Jesus, Jesuits, founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, which took the lead in education and missionary work. The Jesuits and others helped renew Catholic devotion, and the arts were employed to inspire faith. The Baroque style of architecture and music, think of soaring cathedrals and compositions like Bach's Masses or Handel's Messiah, gave glory to God through beauty. The Reformation era also unleashed a series of religious wars in Europe. The conflict between Catholics and Protestants, combined with political power struggles, led to decades of turmoil. In Germany, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, ravaged Central Europe, and in France, bitter wars between Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants, culminated in tragedies like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. England saw seesawing persecutions as the official faith shifted between Catholic and Protestant under different monarchs. Eventually, exhaustion with religious bloodshed prompted new ideas about religious tolerance. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War and allowed rulers to choose either Catholicism or Protestantism for their state, but it also implicitly acknowledged a balance of power that discouraged religious domination by any one side. Thinkers like John Locke later advocated that the state should not impose any single religion, laying groundwork for the modern concept of separation of church and state. In visuals, the religious wars are often shown with battle scenes, cavalry charging, muskets firing, juxtaposed with images of burning churches or civilians suffering, to remind viewers of the human cost of these conflicts. Maps of Europe changing patchwork colors, Catholic versus Protestant regions, illustrate how faith and politics became intertwined. By the mid-17th century, the stage was set for a new phase. Christianity was no longer just the story of Europe, but poised to expand globally, and the ideas of the Enlightenment were just around the corner. While Europe was consumed by Reformation and religious wars, it was also the age of exploration and colonial expansion. European powers, Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Netherlands, set sail across the oceans, and with them went Christian missionaries and colonists who brought their faith to new lands. This era, 15th to 18th centuries, dramatically transformed Christianity into a worldwide religion. In the Americas, Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors, accompanied by Catholic priests, brought Christianity to indigenous peoples, often by force or decree. Following Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, large parts of the Americas were colonized. Spain established missions throughout Latin America and the American Southwest, converting millions of Native Americans, sometimes through sincere mission work, and other times as an extension of imperial rule. Visuals often show Spanish friars like the Franciscans building missions in the New World, or baptizing native people en masse. Of course, this colonization was double-edged. Many indigenous cultures were disrupted or destroyed, and conversion often went hand in hand with conquest. In places like Mexico and Peru, local beliefs blended with Catholic practices. creating a syncretic devotional life that can still be seen, for example, the veneration of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico. Portugal, meanwhile, spread Catholicism to Brazil and carried it to Africa and Asia, like Mozambique, Angola, Goa in India, and East Timor. Protestant nations were also active. The British and Dutch carried Protestant forms of Christianity to North America, the Caribbean, South Africa, and parts of Asia. In New England, Puritans established colonies with a vision of religious freedom for themselves, though not always for others. Missionary activity often followed trade routes. As the British East India Company and other colonial enterprises expanded, chaplains and missionaries went to India, China, and beyond, though conversion was slower in Asia due to strong existing religions. Beyond official colonization, dedicated missionaries took Christianity to remote corners. In the late 16th and 17th centuries, Catholic missionaries like St. Francis Xavier traveled to India, Southeast Asia, and Japan. Jesuits in China like Matteo Ricci learned Chinese language and culture and even gained influence at the imperial court by sharing scientific knowledge, though converting only a modest number of Chinese. The Philippines and Southeast Asia became predominantly Catholic under Spanish rule, unique in Asia. In Africa, early efforts were made by the Portuguese, e.g. in the Congo Kingdom, where a local king converted in the 1490s, but widespread Christianization of sub-Saharan Africa would mostly occur later in the 19th and 20th centuries. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a wave of Protestant missionary societies founded in Europe and America, ignited by a missionary revival. Figures like William Carey in India, Adoniram Judson in Burma, and David Livingstone in Africa are often highlighted as pioneers who carried the gospel to far-off lands. These missionaries sometimes faced tremendous hardships, long sea voyages, tropical diseases, language barriers, and occasionally hostile receptions. Yet they laid linguistic and educational foundations that have had lasting effects, such as translating the Bible into native languages and establishing schools and hospitals. A documentary might follow the journey of one such missionary, showing scenes of travel by sailing ship, encounters with local chiefs, or the first time a written alphabet is created for a previously unwritten language, compelling visuals to represent the meeting of cultures and the spread of faith. By the late 19th century, Christianity had a presence on every continent. Large portions of the Americas were solidly Christian, Catholic in most of Latin America, Protestant in much of North America. The Pacific Islands were evangelized by both Catholic and Protestant missionaries. For example, Hawaii and other Polynesian islands saw conversions of their kings and populace in the 1800s. In Africa, missionary efforts combined with colonialism led to significant growth of Christianity, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where it went from virtually zero Christian presence in 1800 to millions by 1900. One notable image is the conversion of King Nzinga of Congo to Christianity in the 1490s, taking the name Juan I, often cited as the start of a Christian kingdom in Africa, though that early Congo church later waned. By the 19th century, however, many Africans were embracing Christianity anew, sometimes blending it with local customs and sometimes adopting it in very fervent evangelical forms. During this global spread, Christianity also influenced and was influenced by local cultures. In documentary narratives, you might see vibrant cultural expressions of Christianity. For instance, an Andean festival where Christian saints' days are celebrated with indigenous music and dance, or an African church service with drumming and singing. These images show how Christianity became a global faith not by remaining uniform, but by adapting to and incorporating diverse cultural expressions. It's important to note that the globalization of Christianity was intertwined with the rise of the Enlightenment and modernity. The 18th century Enlightenment in Europe emphasized reason, science, and individual rights, challenging traditional religious authority. Philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot were critical of the Church, and revolutions in America, 1776, and France, 1789, brought new secular governments that reduced church power. In France, the revolution even attempted to de-Christianize society, for example, instituting a cult of reason. While Christianity persisted, especially among the masses, intellectual and political leadership in the West grew more secular. This set up a dynamic in the 19th and 20th centuries where Christianity had to coexist with scientific progress, new political ideologies, and eventually the rise of religious pluralism and secularism. As the story enters the 20th century, Christianity truly becomes a global mosaic. The century brought unprecedented challenges: 2 world wars, ideological conflicts like the Cold War, rapid social change, and technological advancement. Christianity both shaped and was shaped by these events, leading to shifts in where and how the faith flourishes. In the early 20th century, much of the world was still under European colonial influence, which meant many societies had Christian missions and churches established. After World War I, 1914 to 1918, and World War II, 1939 to 1945, however, European colonial empires gradually dissolved as nations in Asia and Africa gained independence. This was a critical time for local Christian communities in those regions. Would they survive without foreign support? In many cases, they did more than survive. They grew. Indigenous church leaders emerged, and Christianity increasingly took on a local face in Africa and Asia, rather than being seen as a European import. By the late 20th century, Christianity was declining in its traditional stronghold of Western Europe, and to some extent in North America, in terms of church attendance and influence, but was experiencing explosive growth in the global South, such as Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia. This represents a remarkable shift in the Christian center of gravity. For example, in 1900, about 80% of the world's Christians lived in Europe and North America. By 2000, a majority of Christians lived in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Today, countries like Brazil, Nigeria, the Philippines, and China, despite officially being secular, atheist, have some of the world's largest Christian populations. One of the modern trends boosting this growth has been the rise of Pentecostalism and charismatic movements in the 20th century. Beginning in the early 1900s, the Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles in 1906 is often cited as a key moment. Pentecostal Christianity, with its enthusiastic worship style and belief in gifts of the Holy Spirit, like healing and speaking in tongues, spread rapidly, especially in Latin America and Africa. By the 21st century, hundreds of millions of Christians around the world identified as Pentecostal or charismatic. These movements often appeal across denominational lines and have been very successful in missionary work due to their vibrant worship and community support. Meanwhile, the established churches underwent changes and renewal. The Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, in the 1960s, was a landmark for Roman Catholicism. It modernized many practices, allowing Mass in local languages instead of Latin and promoting dialogue with other Christians and faiths. The Catholic Church also saw charismatic leaders like Pope John Paul II, 1978 to 2005, who, in a highly televised era, traveled widely and inspired many, especially in Eastern Europe, where he is credited with giving hope to those under communist regimes. In the Orthodox world, churches long oppressed under communism, like in Russia, which had severe restrictions on the church from 1917 until the 1980s, experienced revival after the fall of the Soviet Union. Another significant feature of modern Christianity is the ecumenical movement, efforts to encourage cooperation and unity among different Christian denominations. The World Council of Churches was formed in 1948, creating a platform for dialogue among Protestant, Orthodox, and some Anglican and other groups. The Catholic Church has engaged in ecumenical dialogue, but is not an official WCC member. There have been numerous interdenominational initiatives, and while full reunion of major branches hasn't occurred, the atmosphere by the late 20th century was far less combative than in the past. For instance, Catholics and Lutherans in 1999 signed a joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, an issue that was central to their split in the Reformation, finding common ground. Documentaries sometimes highlight historic meetings, like when Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras I lifted the 1,054 excommunications in 1965, a poignant symbolic end to some of the bad blood of the Great Schism. In terms of social impact, Christian individuals and organizations played key roles in many 20th century movements. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister, led the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s to 60s, drawing on Christian principles of justice and love. In Poland, Catholic leaders were integral to the solidarity movement that challenged communism. Across Africa and Latin America, liberation theology emerged, a movement where clergy advocated for the poor and for social justice, sometimes in opposition to authoritarian governments. Christian charities and NGOs have been at the forefront of humanitarian efforts globally, from disaster relief to education and medical care. By the 21st century, Christianity is the most globally diverse religion, found in virtually every country, and expressed in thousands of languages and cultures. It encompasses a vast array of denominations, from Roman Catholic, the single largest, with about 1.3 billion members, to dozens of Orthodox national churches, to tens of thousands of Protestant and independent church denominations. Worship styles range from the ancient liturgies still sung in Greek or Church Slavonic, to African gospel choirs swaying and singing for hours, to megachurches in the United States with rock band-style praise music and jumbotron screens. This rich tapestry means that no single narrative can capture all expressions of Christianity today, but all trace their spiritual heritage back to the figure of Jesus and the early community that followed him in Judea. In visual terms, a modern Christian documentary might show a panorama of worship around the world, a packed cathedral in Rome during an Easter vigil with candles aglow, a mud-brick village church in Nigeria with dancing and clapping, a secret house church meeting in China with believers huddled quietly over smuggled Bibles, and perhaps even the high-tech stage of a Korean or American megachurch. These images drive home how far Christianity has come from its beginnings, and how it continues to adapt and find new life in each generation and culture. The history of Christianity is a sweeping saga, from persecuted disciples huddled in Jerusalem, to emperors and kings adopting the cross, to missionaries braving oceans and jungles, to modern struggles to live out faith in a complex world. It is a story with triumphs and dark chapters, moments of profound spirituality and episodes of conflict. Yet through it all, the central figure of Jesus Christ and his message of love, redemption, and hope has continued to inspire people across time and place. Today, Christianity stands as a global faith, the most diverse and pluralistic of the world's religions, embracing thousands of languages and cultures. By examining its chronological journey, with an appreciation for the vivid scenes and turning points often highlighted in documentaries, we gain insight into how a small movement in an ancient land grew into one of the most influential forces in human history.